Our first speaker is Shane Greenstein, and our commentator will be Janet Abbate, who's one of the foremost historians on the history of the internet. I will say the students will be, before I forget, I'm supposed to make one announcement. This is being recorded. If that is a concern, please let us know. But the idea is to share the discourse that we have here with people who can be here and to make it more, to take the vast knowledge or half-vast knowledge, as it might be, provided by our speakers and share it with not only other people outside the room, but with posterity. And so I hope that that's acceptable. There will be a student here giving you a 5-minute warning and a 1-minute warning. And without any further adu, I turn it over to Shane.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Chris. All right. Thanks for having me. You motivated me to write this, and I want to thank by discussing in advance, and really happy to get your comments. Sorry. Oh, okay. Oh, there you go. Just what I just said. All right, I'm looking at your faces. I just got to figure something out. Half the U.S. population was born after 1980. How many people in this room were born after 1980? The vast majority. Okay, to you, this is history. All right, it's useful to know. I'm speaking. Okay, you'll understand in a minute why. All right. So there's a mainstream economic case for government subsidies of R&D, and it sits comfortably in common conversation with the common understanding of the origins of the internet. The mainstream narrative goes mostly like this. Privately financed R&D avoids risky, usually scientific inquiry. That could produce diffuse future benefits, even when those returns could potentially be high. And the argument is typically that no private firm can get sufficient returns on such investments, and so they don't make them, even though society would likely benefit. That's a very common argument. And the common outline of the internet is, this is one of those examples where the government did the innovation. Virtually all the inventions, in fact, came from government subsidized R&D. Eventually, some private services grew and started a boom in the late 1990s. And then a bust, yeah. But just to be clear, and I'll say it in a moment, the longest sustained 5-year period of economic growth passed 3% since the 1960s. And we have not repeated that since. Productivity growth. Okay, so that's my starting point. So here's the research exercise. Let's compare. Let's actually go a little deeper. Compare the common understanding against the common model, the mainstream economic model. And let's ask if they really are consistent. And then go a little deeper than that and ask, is it complete? In other words, could you just use that mainstream economic narrative in order to explain everything that happened? And then, given that that is not an 8,000 or word less exercise, which is what Christopher assigned me to, you have to choose your audience. And so here I'm going to choose an audience familiar with the mainstream economic narrative, but not the internet's origins. And I hope that's you. And try to balance, try the balancing act, and try to, and if you're really interested, you can read my book, okay? Or you can read the footnotes. That's the idea. Okay, so why would you care about this? Now let me just speed up. Look, this mainstream economic narrative has a very, very long history, going way, way back. We could take thousands of words to describe it. I'm not going to, but it's there. It underpins an awful lot of what we do in the research side of the United States, particularly at NIH and NSF, but certainly elsewhere around the world as well. DARPA, which is going to play an important role in the creation of the internet, comes up a lot. The United States has just finished an experiment with ARPA-E, the one particular variation on the DARPA experiment. The UK today has a new government, in case you didn't know this, and it has someone in that government who is dead set on having the DARPA inside of the UK, so a DARPA UK. This idea is an idea that keeps coming back, and so it merits attention. And more broadly, the internet has been and is and continues to be Exhibit A for why subsidies to R&D can bring economic growth. And for that purpose, we should think hard about the lessons. So here's what the paper does. It's just a three-part exam. The first part is consistency. What I want to do is at least appreciate why the common conversation reaches the conclusion it does. And that is give you some illustrations for why it does appear as if events are consistent with the mainstream economic narrative. And then exposed to issues with the way it's typically done. The two I'll focus on are what I'll call retrospective bias. That is, and then the second one is a sequence of actions. I'll get to it in a moment. But retrospective bias is just because things happened in sequence doesn't mean those who took the first action intended for the latter action to be the case. And they didn't. In fact, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that they didn't. The second one, the compression, is a very common thing we do just for convenience. We say the internet was invented, as if it was just one act, even though it's thousands of actions over a sequence of time. And the sequence is very informative about why it takes the direction it takes. And so we tend to overlook those things. So if you're not going to overlook those things, what do you need? Well, again, in 8,000 words or less. What are the two things you would stand on? The first one I would stand on is the role of lead users. It gives you a different set of insights from what you get from the mainstream economic narrative. The government itself was a lead user. It invented particularly the military was a lead user. NSF also is a lead user in certain respects during this period. And it invented features that were related to its own mission. Did those have a consequence for economic growth later? Yeah, it turned out they did. Was that a purpose behind their invention? No, that was not. And that's going to give us some implications for when you think about moving this kind of program forward. Second, I want to talk just briefly about a very large topic, but you have to recognize this plays a role, and that's the governance of technology transfer. And when you invent things inside the government, it generates technologies that are close to, let's say it this way, when you generate a valuable technology, private firms can see that too. And because they can see that, they are incentivized to affect the transfer from the government's ownership to theirs. Now that transfer can take a number of different channels. It can take a number of different means from government ownership. I'll talk about a couple examples. But what you are going to get, it is almost inevitable, is going to be fraught with lobbying, corruption, biased rules, and so on. And the governance of those choices end up playing an enormous role in what you see in practice, what you see in this particular example, and what you will see in general. Okay? What are the implications? I have a narrow warning to my fellow innovation economists that the common view cuts out too much, and we should not rely solely on consistency. I have a broader warning that imitations of DARPA, which seems to be the flavor of the day now and again, are unlikely to be adequate if we just base them on the mainstream economic narrative, and have to be, forward-looking policy has to be more thoughtful than that. And really, I just think it will be actually rather difficult to replicate the experience we had with the internet. Any ambitious program is going to encounter the issues that arose here and are likely to arise again. Okay, so that's where we're going. So, in the 20 minutes or less at this point, let's just run through it. Consistency. So where does this come from? There really is a set of examples that are consistent with the mainstream economic narrative. The budgets for what became the inventions of the internet really did come from the federal government. That's true. Look, packet switching, which is the basis for what we now regard as the internet, the first prototypes were paid for by the federal government under DARPA's funding. After 1985, what we inherit today as the internet was paid for largely by the NSF. Without government subsidies, this is a long story, but without government subsidies, it's very unlikely we would have gotten something similar. Here, you can, and I did, write a whole book about this. Janet Abbate can and has written a whole book about this. Just to have a couple examples in the paper about AT&T and IBM, the major innovation firms of the time, were not going in this direction. And again, to finish the consistent argument, you can look at economic growth. It's a coincidence that you can put a causal argument on. The internet backbone is privatized in the early 90s. That privatization is finished in 1995. The browser, which is paid for by the National Science Foundation, leaves the university. It goes into a private firm in 1994. Its beta version is November of 94. Its first commercial version is the winter of 95. You get an investment boom in carriers, ISPs, business uses of the internet, all throughout the latter half of the 1990s. You get productivity growth, as I said, sustained past 3% productivity growth for more than half a decade. It sure looks like the internet causes that. Okay? So my bottom line, this doesn't come out of nowhere. Consistency, yeah, the evidence looks like it. Okay? So what are the problems with this? Well, the first problem is a retrospective bias. I kind of already told you this. Just because things happen in sequence doesn't mean the first actors intended for that to happen. DARPA is a mission-driven agency in this era. It's there to help the military. Packet switching has obvious military potential. In this era, remember, it's mainframes. By and large, we're talking about developing technology for communication among mainframes, and then what was thought to be big iron, like mini computers. The DARPA was not empowered to think about its impact on civilians. It wasn't supposed to. It could, but it didn't have to in this case. The second bias is the compression of single action. Just to be very clear, we're talking about more than 20 years of invention. From budgets coming from two different sources. And it's distributed invention. It's not all taking place in one place. It involves scores of major inventors, hundreds of minor inventors. It's unlikely. In fact, it does violation to all that action to compress it into one event. And so it wouldn't surprise anybody if those different budgets, the different stewards, the different composition of inventors would lead to a different set of priorities over time. And maybe we need to think about that. Okay, so an accurate retelling or a complete one wouldn't necessarily just stay with consistency. Okay, that's the argument. So, what do you have to do if you want to write a complete? Well, I would point you towards two things. At a minimum, consider lead user frameworks. Lead user frameworks come in two forms. I'm going to give you a synthesized version. One version of a lead user framework thinks very hard about a set of needs that a particular user faces. They're highly motivated to address those needs prior to the availability of market supply. They'll throw money at it as a consequence and even do some of their own invention in advance of what the market supply will provide or in conjunction with market supply. Eric von Hippel's well known for this kind of framework. Another version of a similar set of ideas that focuses you on slightly different things is to think about general purpose technologies at early moments. There you see co-invention from both the suppliers and users over perceived needs. That's what they're trying to do there, is invent complementary prototypes and processes for specific use cases of interest to the buyer. Again, that framework goes all the way back to Bresnahan and Trachtenberg. And in either case, you can synthesize them. In this case, you would expect to see the lead user addressing challenges affiliated with discontinuities, with present processes and practices, and the invention is aimed at trying to find radical change. Okay, that's what you would do. I just summarized decades of thinking. Read the footnotes, okay? If you follow the footnotes if you really care. Could you use a lead user framework here? Yeah, the military is a lead user in this context, very much so. In fact, I find it very useful when you look at lead users in private industry. They typically start something known as a skunk works. That is a separate entity, distinct from operations. It will be in a separate location. Famously, this comes out of the military aircraft design, the world of military aircraft design. But you find it much more broadly than that. It's housed away from mainstream operations. You can think of DARPA as actually doing that. It's not a complete comparison, but it gives you insight. They organize frontier projects. It is away from operations. It's aimed at long-term value. And as typical for skunk works, it's very difficult to monitor progress. You need very, very sophisticated managers in order to do so, because you don't have a benchmark, an operational benchmark typically. A real key difference with DARPA's action is it's administered from DC, but geographically spread out. That's out of necessity because so many of the contributors are academics and academic engineers or researchers in different locations. And it involves personnel outside of the core organization who's organizing it. That's also a very key difference in this era. Okay. The other thing about learning from experience, that's very true. Just a few examples in the paper. What you see is the kind of co-invention that comes from unexpected problems that emerge. Email is particularly well documented, and so you even have in the early days one of the program managers at DARPA invents one of the functionality, pieces of functionality in common email. Okay, that reply all, by the way, in case you were curious. At NSF, you see very similar behavior. You have to be very careful. NSF has two very different parts to it. One part is what most people are familiar with, which is the National Science Foundation subsidizes research inside academic settings. You write grants. A professor writes a grant. The NSF sends you money. You try to realize the grant. That goes on just fine in this era. There's another side to NSF. This is the one I'm speaking about. Mostly is the operational side of NSF, and that is it runs the network. It manages the network. It then has subcontracts it out to IBM MCI and an academic mission in Michigan, and then they have to manage that part. They subsidize the administration of that to support research in the United States. That second part, that's where the lead user behavior is taking place, if you will, in this case. They have three priorities at the beginning. That's to share files between supercomputers and elsewhere, and then to share resources among users, and then finally to scale to wider use. That third priority, they achieve all three, and that third priority, I'm simplifying a complicated story, and that third one ends up becoming a major part of what they end up doing. If you want to understand why the internet scales so well when it privatizes, you have to go into the detail of what NSF did during this time to make the internet easy for students to use and easy for universities to administer. Universities, after all, are not the most efficient administered organizations on the planet. So you've got something that even a university could administer. Let's say it that way. And that's great. That's why it spread so far. It's such a robust technology that many can plug their existing ISP technologies into, and there we go. All right, let me keep going. I know in the interest of time. So first of all, you walk away with a narrow conclusion. You can't understand this experience solely based on the mainstream narrative, and the more narrow observation that you need to understand lead users, and more broadly, mission-driven innovation it brings something additional to the table. Let me give the last part, because it's important to get to technology transfer. Again, summarizing decades of thinking. There are multiple channels through which technology moves out of government subsidies. It's absolutely essential to think about this, otherwise you aren't bringing the proper lessons from this example. 3 key channels in this case are going to be giving away assets. Today you see that most often in shareware, by the way. You literally are just giving away the asset, the software. Another one is you get intellectual property, a university gets intellectual property and then licenses, either exclusively or widely or in a variety of different ways. And the third one is students, faculty, administrators get knowledge and then they leave. And those are all channels for technology to leave a university. And I'm just going to make the assertion, what you observe in private industry ends up being determined a lot by which of these channels becomes the primary channel for the deployment of the technology. Private firms have incentives to affect those channels and the way they're designed. As soon as you can see that it's going to have an effect on your industry, of course you're going to lobby for something. It's fraught with this. And the core issue is, what do you do if you're a manager in such a situation? That is a core problem here. It will always be a core problem here. It was, in this case, a particularly difficult problem because the NSF had something known as the acceptable use policy, which forbid it from innovating in directions that competed with private industry, which meant that, just to give examples, they had no experience with organizing the pricing of carrier services or exchanging data among otherwise competing carriers. So they had no way to know, because they couldn't know, they were forbidden to do the experiment of how to organize it. Another wonderful example is they had little experience from which to judge the value of electronic commerce. They kind of had an idea it might be useful. They kind of knew, but they didn't actually know because they couldn't build the prototypes. That was forbidden. Now, never mind, there was an enormous number of prototypes. We could talk about it at IBM at the time. They also built some prototypes that turned out not to be right either. But that's the interesting thing. You have to build them in order to get a good idea of where things are going. NSF had no idea, had some idea or a vague idea, and so you would expect the challenge. So I'm just going to give you a couple stories because I know no better way to tell this than to just tell you the stories. And I'm going to summarize some long stories. And if you get me drunk tonight, I'll tell you even more stories. Okay, or over a beer, I can tell you a lot of stories. Janet, actually, I don't know if she drinks, but if you get something in her, she knows even more stories than I do. So here's one story. The privatization of the internet backbone was, in fact, the way it was organized was just to give away the asset. Now, there's more to it than that, but basically it was the NSF was going to renounce its public ownership and make it a private asset, so there would be no government ownership. In the midst of doing that, IBM's lawyers tried to manipulate the rules so that nobody else can interconnect with the backbone except them. It was great. I mean, God, lawyers are paid to do that. 5 minutes is great. This attempt did not succeed, primarily because it received some bad publicity and there was direct congressional action to address it. Summarizing again a long story. The fallout was really very interesting from this action. Fallout number one is it outraged a number of the other smaller firms who were going to be carriers, and they began experimenting with ways to avoid IBM's interconnection rules. and invented what became the Computer Internet Exchange, which at the end of the day is one of what has turned out to be many methods for exchanging data from otherwise competitive carriers. Okay? But it was the first. That's what they get credit for. CICS also has this wonderful characteristic that it inspires the NSF. Once it's in trouble, it gets congressional investigation. There's a GAO investigation. They've got to redo their privatization plan. Steve Wolf has to redo the whole thing. Because it's motivated CICS, he looks at CICS, uses that as an example to do the metropolitan May West and May East. I'm forgetting exactly what it stands for. These are the data interchange points that the NSF fosters, which helps to get us a competitive backbone industry. Now, to be very clear, the NSF efforts go out of business, essentially become irrelevant in a couple of years. But that, if you read the history of what happened, it was essential to start us at a competitive industry, and then it took off from there. And the broad observation is just, you should expect this transferring of assets to be a mess, and my goodness, it was. Okay? I'm going to use one other illustration. The paper has a couple more, but I just love this story because I used to work at the University of Illinois, and so I like talking about my former employer. The University of Illinois had something called the NCSA, the National Center for Supercomputer Applications. It was funded by NSF. It was a supercomputer center. It was an enormous place. Had many, many projects there. And among the projects it had in the early 90s was a set of programmers. 6 of them were doing something called a browser for something called the World Wide Web. And they first did it on Linux, and then they got this idea. Who would have known? They put it onto Windows, and that became popular. So this project, which had been really unimportant for NCSA, is suddenly starting to become really, really important. So now, the university does what it's a state university. They're under a lot of pressure. They're underfunded by their state legislature. They're under lots of pressure to show benefit to the state of Illinois. So they do just what all their peers tell them to do, is they assert under Bayh-Dole ownership over the software and start a licensing program for the browser through an intermediary. And they get more than 100 licensees, and boy, that's just what they're supposed to be doing. And in fact, they get 108 licensees. The 108th is a small firm from Redmond, Washington, named Microsoft. Microsoft is the 108th, and just to make a long story short, the 108th licensee puts the previous 107 out of business. But so that's partially what happens. The other thing that happens is, out of control from the university, the programmers themselves get really upset about the assertion of ownership. One of them in particular, a guy named Mark Andreessen, is graduating anyway. And so he decides to go to Palo Alto. He's offered a job by the university. He tells them to go to hell, more or less. He finds Jim Clark. They start a firm called Mosaic Communications Corporation. They get sued, by the way, by the university for using the word Mosaic. So they change their name to Netscape, and they end up catalyzing the industry. I'm just that a long story short. And just to say, the bottom line is, the university's policies used one channel, but the one the university didn't foster ends up being the effective channel. Okay. Meanwhile, we aren't done with the story. There's web servers. None of the stuff is useful without a web server. I know most of you probably never paid attention to a web server, but you have to have web servers. Meanwhile, the web server is neglected by the university. Eric Bina is the one who actually puts it together. He's an amazing guy, underappreciated by most of us. He gets hired by Netscape, at which point the web server gets neglected. The university doesn't know what to do. Being an incompetent university, like most public universities, the web server goes without a webmaster for a year in the middle of 1995. Okay. And what happens instead? Well, webmasters around the world get really frustrated, so they take matters into their own hands. You get just the convention you'd expect. They put it together themselves in a patch. They call themselves Apache, and that effort becomes the most widely used web server in the world for the next dozen years. Again, the university's actions at some level, neglect is what gets us the good outcome. And so just to show you, this transfer is the thing we have to worry a lot about. Okay, so the bottom line, worry about transfers, and it's inescapable. I think you get the point. So let me reiterate. Yes, the internet's history is consistent with the mainstream economic narrative. Please don't stop there. If you have to go at least a little further, think about lead users as playing a crucial role. Think about technology transfer and its governance as playing a crucial role. That's a narrow warning, not to understand this technology rather narrowly. It's a broader warning not to implement technology policy merely using the mainstream economic narrative, and a little bit of caution about if we should try this again. It may actually be very difficult to recreate, and if you really want to, follow the footnotes. If you're really curious, and I'd be happy to talk to you. Yeah, shameless. I'm going to end with shameless plug. Shameless plug at the end. Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you, Shane. I actually don't, it's funny, as we started, I realized that I'd meant to shamelessly plug your book before, so I'm grateful to you for stepping into the breach. Just so you know, you say that everyone uses, you're talking about things like email, well, everyone knows this. The research he did is against what economists usually do. He actually talked to the people who created email. And you said, really, for the first time, no one had ever really spoken with them, or no one had really written this up, and it's written a whole series of vignettes about really, that shed new light in how the internet actually works. And so I think it's one of these books which, if you're interested in this, you'll find fascinating to read. And I really encourage you to do so. And that's why I'm so delighted that you're here and you're one of my friends. The other pleasure I get is to introduce Janet. This is a homecoming. Janet got her doctorate from Penn and wrote, as her dissertation became one of the most influential books on the history of the internet called Inventing the Internet, which is, to me, whenever I want to know anything, it's the standard source I pull off the shelf to look at. It's an exquisitely researched book, and she's gone on to look at other aspects of the privatization, which is a part of it which I've assigned not only to this class, but to my internet law class. You'll be delighted to know. And I can't imagine anyone better versed in the history of the internet who would give us a reaction to Shane's comments. So without further ado, Janet, come on.
Thank you for inviting me. These interdisciplinary conversations are so important, and I look forward to learning a lot from all of you. Shane Greenstein uses the commercialization of the internet to examine the mainstream economic theory that society benefits when governments subsidize risky R&D with large but diffuse payoffs. And he argues that the mainstream model is not so much wrong as incomplete. Such investment can pay off, but it's much more likely to pay off if there are lead users to test the technology under operational conditions, and there are technically competent, disinterested managers to guide it through the process of transfer. Shane's analysis fills in some of the dots of what historians of science call the linear model, whereby basic research leads to applied research, which leads to applications and economic growth. The linear model provides the convenient fiction that all government has to do is pour money in at the basic research end, and social benefits will pop out the other. The linear model has been attacked by historians and declared dead. They point out that that's not how science works. Yet it continues to rise zombie-like as a justification for government investment. Greenstein attacks it from a different angle, arguing that this is not how good governance works either. I'd like to briefly discuss three key insights that stood out to me from Shane's talk. First is the fallacy of assuming that what happened was the outcome that was actually planned, and that these future benefits are what motivated the actions of the participants. If you go back and look at what people were saying at the time, you'll find that at almost no point in internet history did the people in charge accurately predict what would happen with the technology. I've characterized the NSF privatization in my article, in particular as being chaotic, because there were multiple actors with different agendas. Each actor was changing their plans rapidly in response to the others, and nobody was completely in charge of the process. So it really is not an example of planning, it's an example of a chaotic process where a small change could really have tilted it in a different direction. So the lesson from this history is not that there were folks who could see the future and they made plans that led to good outcomes, and so we should emulate their planning. Instead, we should focus on figuring out why these innovations were successful despite the fact that nobody saw what was coming and everyone changed their plans. What aspects of the system made it adaptable, resilient, and open to new inputs and goals? This includes not just the technology, but the institutions, relationships, and governance mechanisms that were put in place during DARPA and NSF's stewardship. And I think Shane's talk really gets at the importance of some of these institutional aspects. The second key point is that technologies are reshaped in important ways through operational use by lead users, and that different government agencies will have different types of users who push the technology in different directions. I wrote a lot in the book about the role of users and how they kind of took the ball in different directions, so I won't really go into that. I'll only add that not only did the type of users change, but the diversity of users increased during NSF's tenure as new participants were added. So it started out just computer scientists under DARPA, and then it broadened to scientists in general, and then college students, commercial users, and eventually the general public. Having diverse users pushes the system toward flexibility and decentralization, because the system operators at some point can't handle the diversity, and they tend to push some of the responsibility for creating new features onto the users. So operational experience by a diverse range of lead users, I would argue, seems more likely to lead to optimal results. Third, and maybe most importantly, this paper directs our attention beyond technical innovation to questions of technology transfer. Often the difficulty with technology transfer is how to turn basic knowledge into workable products. And NSF often encountered this problem, especially with engineering research. But with the internet, this was not so much the case. DARPA had made a point of fostering a commercial market for TCP in the 1980s. So they had subsidized the development of the software and routers and Ethernet versions. So there was a robust technical base. There were still big technical challenges involved in scaling up, but NSF was transferring an operational network, not a concept. And the businesses involved already saw how they were going to profit from it, and indeed that led to conflict. So the market was already there. So the main dilemmas with technology transfer were not so much technical, but policy issues of fairness and governance. Greenstein describes one of the fairness issues when IBM tried to leverage its NSF contract to create a monopoly on the commercial backbone. The public outcry over this concerned fairness. It was not, economic growth alone was not the only measure of success of this privatization effort. Governance issues are thornier, and they have proved to be a pervasive issue, and especially if you look at the global internet and not just the US, governance issues are just an ongoing source of tension. Shane makes a point in his book, How the Internet Became Commercial, that NSF as a research agency didn't have regulatory power, which limited its ability to put conditions on the technology transfer. As he put it, NSF had carrots but no sticks. I described in my article some of the consequences of this limitation on the privatization process. For example, NSF couldn't require robust security, which is a legacy that haunts us today. NSF couldn't require ISPs to collect and make available internet traffic data, which would have been beneficial to researchers as well as governance efforts. NSF couldn't require that the network serve less profitable customers, the way AT&T, under its monopoly, had been required to provide phone service in poor neighborhoods and rural areas. And this led to a decade of hand-wringing about a digital divide in America. So the lack of regulatory ability really distorted the way NSF was able to transfer this technology. So I would offer as a policy question whether and how a government research agency could possibly partner with one or more regulatory agencies so that technology transfer can be integrated with appropriate oversight. It's true that not all regulatory issues are foreseeable at the time of transfer, but many of these issues with the internet were raised at the time. So what if there had been a policy mechanism to actually act on them? Finally, Greenstein raises the issue of which channels for technology transfer will have the best results. He mentions giving away the technology, licensing it, or transferring technical knowledge through the movement of people. I'm not convinced you actually answered that question, and I'd like to hear more about your thoughts about how to choose among them. Unless your answer was that we don't know. You wrote, the economic trade-offs were non-obvious and unintended consequences defined many of the outcomes. Also, I would like to have seen you connect the role of lead users with this issue of transfer. You explain the role, the importance of lead users in the innovation phase, but often these same people or organizations are active in transfer, whether by educating the next generation of technologists, because remember these were universities mainly in the NSF net, or by leaving to start their own companies. But these are really quibbles. It's clear from your examples that the issue of how technology transfer should occur is important, and we need to think about policy for transfer and not just innovation. I'm going to stop here because I want to leave more time for discussion, and I really look forward to hearing your comments.
The floor will be open for questions, but I want to tease out. I'm going to give Shana a chance to offer any comments following Janet's, that perhaps answering her last question about your unanswered question in your work, or
You can't answer. You can't provide a general answer, not in an article like this. I didn't answer it. It only went so far as to point out its importance. So use the examples to illustrate that, and to remind that these kinds of questions are inevitable as well. As far as I could go. I would say, by the way, just knowing what tends to be happening in the federal government these days, there's a tendency to use open licensing as a default now for most software. That's the tendency you see in most federal agencies, and it's partially just because they want to avoid everything else. That they've seen all the other problems, and so open licensing has this characteristic that they don't get in trouble. That's because it just treats everybody the same. You stick it on a shareware site, and then you don't have to be responsible for anything. And that's actually you tend to see now in many federal agencies when they have software interventions. And it's I'm not saying that's the right answer, but it's partially as a consequence of these sorts of examples that you see that. Okay.
well, it's fantastic, and it really strikes me that when you identify some of the personal dynamics around Andreessen and the IBM attempt, it's almost inherently unpredictable. I mean, because it's idiosyncratic of individual actors, which makes the challenge of trying to understand how a government can actually subsidize innovation all the more chaotic.
Yeah, I could shamelessly plug one of my thesis advisors as well. Roger Knoll's also got this, a book. Cohen and Knoll has a series of case studies in it that brings out that theme with great richness across a large set of examples. I think the interesting question posed by Cohen and Knoll is, for the internet, is why did it work out? Because when you see so many of the examples in there, satellites get, remembering off the top of my head, but satellites get delayed for years because of the mess. And photovoltaics. Oh yeah, that's another one. And it's just the mess gets in the way. And here, one of the things I kept puzzling over was why did we get an outcome that was positive? Yeah, luck. You know, you could say luck, but I mean, I always come down on, I have this phrase, honest policy wonks. Congressman Butcher intervened at a good moment, to his credit, by the way, to change the NSF charter. The actors at KICS, they took initiative at the right moment. Again, it's you have to depend on that, I guess. So we could keep going on, but that's...
Sure. Well, I will open the floor to questions. I will say each of you has a microphone in front of you. It is push to talk. There is actually a configuration which we do in class that if any time you talked, it would automatically come on. We have relieved you of that responsibility. So if you do not press your button, you will not be broadcasting the entire room. Anyway, Gus.
We also have a microphone if anyone can't figure out.
Thank you.
So it looks like it's push and hold to talk.
Yes, it is. Push and hold to talk.
As always, great, fascinating, interesting discussion. Part of the history that I'm wondering if you have any comments on is the fight between the U.S. approach and the emerging EU regulatory approach in the 1980s into the 1990s, where Europe was trying to implement its own much more rigorously developed internet. This led us to David Clarke's famous "We Reject Kings," rough code running consensus speech, and how that dynamic plays into all of this.
Oh, that's a rich question. You've written a lot about this too. Do you want to go first? All right.
Well, I mean, I think it is important. We've really focused mainly on the U.S. in this, in these talks, and the situation is so different on so many levels. The structure of the telecoms industry, where you have these national carriers, and again, thinking about the importance of timing, because many of those national carriers got privatized in the 80s and beyond, and so if that was the environment when the world was building computer networks, maybe things would have been very different. And so it's not simply the technical ideas, but also this economic and regulatory landscape that things are being built into.
I mean, the other thing I would say is, several of the European countries tried to lead top-down efforts that did not deploy past their borders. And the internet had the internet, that is the combination of packet switching with open standards and institutions for publishing and bringing in suggestions from outsiders, deployed more widely, partly because it was so inclusive isn't quite the right word, but because it had the back and forth. And though U.S. born, European researchers loved it because they could just get it to work now, and they didn't have to wait for their governments. Now, that governance today has its issues, and it has a hard time getting things done. But at the time, it was, it got things done. It got an international data network deployed much faster than any alternative at the time.
But what your answer says it's not about the technology, it's the other things. Because the irony is the European, both Louis Pouzin in France and the British, they were actually closer to the technical design that we adopted. So wasn't it, we borrowed the technology for
it's
them.
It's the institutions, yeah. It's open systems. Open systems, and let's be very clear what an open system is in this context. An open system is a setting in which once the standards are designed, they're published immediately. There's no restriction on use. So the legal, I'm trying to speak to a legal audience, there's no reach-through rights. So the ownership doesn't convey the owner a right to tell someone else what to do with the standard, and it doesn't give them the ability to do. The internet was set up in such a way so that once you published it, it became available to anyone and they could do whatever they wanted. One of the interesting problems with that system is it's very difficult to coordinate, And Tim Berners-Lee's experience sort of illustrates that well. When he first invents the World Wide Web, which is 3 different technical components. By the way, he went to the IETF and wanted it standardized as a standard. He thought that would help it deploy. He could not get the subcommittees to agree. They just kept arguing. He eventually got so frustrated that he started his own, consortia. And today we still have this separation of layers as a consequence. But when you look at what Tim set up, the World Wide Web Consortia is also open, but doesn't run quite the same way as the IETF. It puts Tim Berners-Lee in there as the king. And he did that very explicitly because he was so frustrated with its inability to coordinate at a moment in time. So he left himself in a position, he still publishes, he gives consortium member rights to see things sooner, but then everything becomes public. He still takes outside suggestion, but he gives himself the right to make a decision in order to stop this.
Janet, do you have anything to add?
I mean, the question of international governance is so important, and it's not clear to me. It could have gone either way in a way. I mean, for a while it was the US policy that we were going to adopt the open system protocols and join this kind of global consortium, or at least first world consortium. And to some extent, the technology kind of got away from that agreement because TCP/IP was so much more developed. At the same time, the US kind of made their project more global by getting people from France and England and Japan and all the other countries building networks, Lee Bazin and Donald Davies and people to collaborate on TCP/IP so that their concerns were kind of folded in there and some of the things that would make it work elsewhere. So it wasn't just we invented it in the US and other people adopted it, it was we brought them in, made sure it would work for them, and then it diffused much more easily because of that. And at the same time, there was this global standards effort, and it was kind of like, well, which way is it going to flip? But so it's a little more complicated than saying, well, it's just the US over here or the European world standard over there. And they kind of, the standards kind of met in the middle. Some of the US standards became options in the open systems, and it's messy.
But it does avoid the existing telecom institutions. That's the one thing it does do. It works outside of it was designed to work outside of what existed at the time, which was, for all the government-funded telecom firms. It worked outside of those institutions.
But compared to that status quo, that was a win. What we're seeing now is the reality of the decentralization of the internet. And the hard part about that is each of the individual networks responds to its own incentives. You're getting at this with the different actors. We had an outcome that was a product of a bunch of people pursuing a bunch of different agendas. And what we're seeing in international internet governance is that emerging more strongly.
Yeah, governments are taking over. We're seeing the internet splinter.
But what's interesting is when you have individualized incentives and decision-making, there's no guarantee that it will add to a collective decision that has any particular globally beneficial qualities. And in a sense, it makes your work, the paper you're setting up, all the more remarkable. I mean, it looks a lot more like the luck that Roger is talking about, is that all the incentives happen to line up that way. Is there anything more we can say about the preconditions that can we do things that make that more likely? You talk about opening standards, that's things within the government's control, but there's a bunch that's outside. Do we have nothing to say, or is there something we can say about how we influence that to make it more likely for us to government subsidies program to be land well? Because isn't that ultimately the question?
Proactively can create the private user community that's going to become a political lobbying group in favor of perpetuation of producing a general purpose technology instead of a special purpose technology.
But that would assume you have a theory or an idea of what a good user how to do that well.
And that's why it's bound to have a lot of failures. And
If you push your button, Roger.
Right.
The question we could address is, let's look at all the general purpose technologies created by DARPA since 1990. short paper.
Yeah, so interesting, right? DARPA, when it came to autonomous vehicles, rather than take the model of this, of what we're observing in the internet, DARPA goes to the Grand Challenge model, which is a different a model for fostering innovation. Right? So they just encourage it with a contest. So they still are playing a coordinating role there, but a different role than in this paper. Here's another one, Roger, I think is very interesting, is clones. So there's been an enormous amount of innovation in the autonomous vehicle side for clones in the air for military purposes. And some of that is starting to work its way back into private industry. But it's very delicate because it's also very dangerous.
You mean drones?
Drones, I mean, yeah, drones. Sorry, yeah, drones. Did I say clones? Yeah. Send in the clowns, okay? So send in the clones. Yeah, drones. That's one where DARPA has done a lot of work, and it's starting to deploy into private industry. You see it in agriculture now, for example. But it's people are very, very worried about it because we don't. You've got a lot of things flying in the air. I mean, there's some obvious issues with that.
I think that also points to the importance of having a diversity of lead users, developers as well, and don't get me started on the lack of diversity in the computer industry, but to have people there, like autonomous vehicles is a good example. If you think about people with disabilities, kind of simulations with autonomous vehicles routinely run over people in wheelchairs, and they don't recognize them. They don't know it's a person. And so the idea of getting people in there on the ground floor to develop and to be the sort of lead users to say, oh, this is really not working. This needs it's not a tweak, it needs a fundamental shift in terms of what is a person. A person is not just an able-bodied person on two legs. It could be a mother with a baby carriage. It could be someone in a wheelchair. These people are typically not in DARPA's lead user groups. And sort of in general, it's going to be more robust the more different perspectives you see. You can kind of head off problems that could have been avoided if you had a more kind of diverse group of people involved.
Well, we could do this all day, but I'll make sure we bring in Jerry and others.
Thank you. I have a lot of history here. Nothing as good as Shane has done, but I do have one advantage over him, which is I'm a great deal older. In fact, what I would like to do is add something to what Shane had to say. In 1991, I attended a conference at Harvard, and the NSF had just announced it was about to open up the internet. Okay? Now we have to understand what that meant. Up until that point, no commercial user, unless they were associated with the Defense Department, could be on the internet. You just couldn't. Okay? Now they were going to turn over control of the internet to IBM, UUNet, MCI, what have you. Nobody at the conference cared about that. What they cared about was that NSF was proposing to open it up to commercial use. Every user at that conference thought that was the worst possible idea. They said, oh my God, they're going to charge us $0.25 to send an email. This is awful. We can't do this. Okay? I was invited as an economist to be there to sort of try to argue the other side, that maybe this was a good idea. I got nowhere. Okay? The notion that somehow the commercials are going to take this over, it's going to be terrible, the whole internet's going to crash, what have you, was a very strong element there. Fortunately, the NSF went ahead and did it. But you have to remember what it was like at the time. It was just extreme. Let me make a second point, which is about the internet being presaged by what went on in Europe. It's not the only time that's happened, and I would suggest you look at two industries where this has also happened. One is radar, in which the British were really the first in this, and the second is jet aircraft, where both the British and the Germans were way ahead of us, okay, in terms of the basic unit. And of course, we run the show right now. So that's an example of, yes, the Europeans were ahead of us, but they couldn't stay there.
And and to me, your work really does go against the European model, which is top-down, throw money at it. And the incompleteness of that point of view. I keep thinking about the Europeans need to read your work and Janet's work to understand that there are other elements that have to be there for them to succeed. And that the industry, that the problem though is what Jerry's bringing out is you can't just listen to the broad-based participation because sometimes that doesn't know. What you had was an NSF program manager who just said, we're not doing that. We're not doing what the community seems to think what they want and to have a strong vision. And to get people like that's correct, that takes a lot of courage. I'm just trying to figure out, how do you foster that? How do you, just by being lucky enough to have the right people in the right places, or is there something more we can say?
I don't know, I'm old-fashioned. I think ideas matter. Maybe you can convince, maybe you write papers like this to people learn lessons.
I like that. Catherine.
I just wanted to, thinking about technology transfer, I wanted to raise a sort of completely different context and just see what you guys thought about it, where we do things very differently, and that's drug development. So there is a huge amount of government-sponsored research, and then what tends to happen is we have very exclusive sorts of arrangements, and obviously there are reasons why this happens. We need FDA regulation, et cetera, but you could say it's not working out all that well. And so I guess I'm just kind of curious whether you have any thoughts about the comparison there. Obviously it's a very different sort of technology, but it is similar in that it relies so much on upstream government investment.
It's a big topic. So there are boundary issues there, for sure. Let me say someone could write a paper very similar to mine. This is an answer to you. You'll see in a moment. Is what happens in pharma and medicine consistent with the mainstream economic narrative? In fact, it is in some specific cases. And to give you an example, there was an awful lot of research into immune systems. It was science with no particular goal in mind 40, 50 years ago. It has, in time, developed into very specific therapies for turning your immune system on high in the event that there's cancers. And commercial firms have now figured out how to implement that. And what do you know? It does actually cure people, and it's a wonderful thing. And it's the linear model, if you will. So could you find examples consistent? Yes, you could. Is that the whole story? Good Lord, not. And it would be an error to do that. And so you could, and then we could go down this, do you get the problems of the boundaries? My goodness, you do. Exactly the same set of problems where you get discovery inside universities that have immediate commercial implications, and you have the same transfer issues all over again. Then, in addition, you've got private R&D also taking place in response to perceived need, some of which is using what's happening in the federal government, some of which is not. And the simple story, of course, doesn't apply there at all. So I hesitate to give you a general answer there because, of course, it's much more complicated.
It's an interesting thought experiment because that's pretty much the opposite regulatory regime. I mean, so heavily regulated because of the life and death implications. And then the internet is kind of ideologically seen as beyond regulation because we're going to kill the golden goose somehow if we do any. And so I think there are all kinds of issues with the internet about negative externalities and issues of liability, and we see this now with things like privacy, fake news, election interference, and nobody's accountable. We don't even know how to define them in terms of regulation. Are they publishers? Are they common carriers? What are they? And so with the internet, part of the price of this particular path toward unprecedented economic growth was sort of pushing really important policy issues down the road that we're now kind surrounded by, and I think that's a really important part. Like, should we have thought of those before, or is this the way we do it, but now we need to do something and nobody knows what it is?
But one way to interpret something you said right now with something Shane said earlier, the internet deployed against a legacy of government-owned, centrally controlled monopoly telephone providers, which is not the case in pharma. And so you see that the context in which you introduce this funding may have interesting play out in different ways because of the industrial organization that you put it into. And it's interesting that it could lead to a more, if you will, prescriptive theory about how where the number of entry points into that process and the number of choice points are, create a different set of opportunities in pharma that didn't exist, that make the linear model more plausible. I'm obviously just speculating.
Oh, I go a different way with your comment, which is pharma. The history of pharma regulation in the United States particularly goes back to thalidomide and the prevention of a horrific outcome, playing an outsized role in the FDA's actions to stop the low probability but potentially high costly outcome, to give you a simplified model. And then a bureaucracy built up around that. You could imagine, and it is already starting to happen in many countries, that the prevention of some bad outcome, a security breach, fake news, whatever you think the bad outcome is in your government, is justifying heavy-handed regulatory intervention in the internet. And in many countries, that's what we're observing now. And it's parallel, if I'm trying to use your parallel idea. And it is resulting in very different internets, at least in the media space, across the world now. In some repressive countries, of course, you have no internet, really functional internet at all. And, or you get these sort of hampered internets in China, for example, where you get just some things are available. You can't get Wikipedia, you can't get Facebook, and so on. So by metaphor, actually, yeah, that's a good comparison.
Josh.
As a person whose political experience is limited to just the 20 teens, the concept of an honest policy wonk is a little bit foreign. The Roger Pielke's notion of an honest broker already was as a stretch to say that scientists could separate themselves from the political fray, and these days it seems even less likely that a policymaker could separate themselves. And so I was wondering if you still think we can rely on regulatory agencies to be even-handed overseers, or if a revision of the Bayh-Dole Act for physical assets or for renewed technology transfer would be a better way to standardize technology transfer from research agencies.
Oh, I have enough humility to know that I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry, I won't be able to give you a satisfying answer. The one thing not to rely on is just solely a cynical view of things. I've spent time in the government. Yes, I understand some fraction of it. The cynical view does apply. The amazing thing you find is there are also people inside the government who are trying to do the right thing. It's not the only thing going on, of course. You see a variety of things happening. Just don't rely solely on the cynical one. I'm sorry to not give you the complete answer. How about that?
Well, but I would take your approach that you presented to us by looking at anecdotes and not make too much of them. The cynical view, and to me the failure of public choice theory or positive political theory is it's very good at autopsies. It's very bad at prescription, and what the real invitation would be is there's a number of very salient puzzles of policy successes that go against the cynical narrative. The most obvious of which is, for example, airline deregulation in 1978. There's no good political economy explanation for that. And so we need to study, if you look at the whole range of historical examples, you can't just pick the failures and generalize. You have to actually look at it and get a theory about why certain things succeed as well as why things fail, which is sort of consistent with how you're framing these problems. Rod, George, you get the last. Well, for that, we'll have to hear from you in the last panel, Roger. Anyway, we're actually at time now. Please join me in thanking Shane and Jennifer.